In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front brakes on this Ford Excursion. Let's get started. Use a 21mm socket and remove all 8 lug nuts, and then we can pull the wheel off. Now from the back side of the caliper, I'm going to first stick a pry bar right through these slots here and just compress the pistons a little bit. This is going to make it easier for the caliper to come off. Sometimes it stays with pressure applied. Just slowly pry it in. There we go. A little bit at the top, a little bit at the bottom. It's a dual piston caliper. This makes it so it releases pressure a little bit. Then we're going to use an 18mm socket and remove the 2 caliper slider bolts. And this will separate the caliper from the bracket. With the caliper removed, let's set it aside. Let's remove the brake pads. These are very stuck, so I'm going to use a pry bar and a small hammer and tap them out. There's one. Remove the other one as well. And there's the other. Now back on the caliper, we're going to push the pistons in. I'm going to put a brake pad in here just as a spacer. Doesn't really matter in which direction you put it in, as long as it stays. And what you want is a dual caliper depression tool so that it can press on both pistons at the same time. And gently press these in. At this point, you could open the bleeder screw as well to let the fluid out if you wanted to. This should go smoothly with minimal pressure. If you need a lot of force to press these in, that means they're seized and you would need a new caliper. Now, mine bottomed out completely, so I'm going to remove my tool and my brake pad, and I'm going to put this on top of the front leaf spring where it's not going to put pressure on the brake hose if it hangs. Use a 21mm socket to remove the bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the front axle. With this one out, I'm going to leave it in a couple threads so it can hold the bracket for me as I remove the lower. Remove this one completely. Now you can also remove the top, but hold the bracket in place. And now you can remove the bracket off the front axle. We'll set this aside for cleaning. At this point, you should be able to take your rotor off. That's not held on with anything anymore, but ours is seized on the hub. So what I will do is take a hammer, and on the caliper side where it was, you can tap it from the back side. Now you could also put a lug nut on so that if it does break free, it's not going to allow it to go flying off. And then twist the rotor as you hammer, which is what I'm going to do, so that you can hammer it from different angles, hopefully break it free. There we go. Now you can remove your lug nut and remove the rotor. Now we want to clean the surface of the hub so the new rotor can mount nice and flush. All of this rust needs to basically go away, and I'm going to use a sanding disc because it's quite severe. Now if yours isn't as bad, you could use a wire brush, a wire wheel, and a drill, whatever you have that's going to get this cleaned up nice and flat. But if you're going to use a sanding disc, don't use something that's going to eat through the material and create divots. Basically, that's also going to be, well, not a flat surface for the rotor to mount. So here we go. On top of cleaning this, I will take a wire brush, clean right in between the studs and also right around here, this lip basically that is where the rotor seats when it's fully mounted, and that's also where it's likely to get stuck. So I'm going to clean up all that rust with a wire brush. Once you're done cleaning, rinse it all off with some brake parts cleaner so we can then apply some anti-seize to prevent corrosion in the future. If you have access to compressed air, you could speed up the drying process by blowing it off with a blowgun. And like I said, apply some anti-seize, either with a brush or a spray, so that you can prevent corrosion from building up in the future. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. If you get a little bit on there, that's all right, just wipe it off, but don't load them up. Now get the new rotor, slide it on, and I like to put it on backwards. This will hold it on for me so I can clean the braking surface. Typically there are oils covering the rotor so that it doesn't rust on the shelf. This particular one does not have that, but regardless, use brake parts cleaner, rinse it all off. You don't want anything on the surface, you want it nice and clean. Once you've done that, you can take it, flip it over, and install it the right way. Press it on, and we're going to clean the outer braking surface as well the same way. With the caliper bracket on our bench, we can prepare it for installation, and that requires cleaning. We have to clean and re-lubricate the slider pins, and this is actually a good thing to point out here. This boot was actually supposed to be seated right here. Now somehow it's still sealed up because I have clean grease and no rust in here. Often when that happens, it gets rotted out. Sometimes it seizes completely to the point where you would even need to replace this. In my case, all I have to do is just wipe this old grease off, and I will actually take this over to my wire wheel so I can clean all that rust up so that the boot can seal up. However, before I do that, I'm also going to clean inside of the boot. Stick your rag in there and kind of twist it around just like this. This is going to pull all of the old grease out, which there really wasn't much to begin with. I will be using silicone paste that is rated for brakes. That means that it can withstand high temperatures. You can use brake grease if that's all you have, but if you are using silicone paste, make sure it's rated for brakes because not all of it is. Otherwise, it will just basically melt out. And I'm putting it inside the boot here. If it gets into the folds, it'll kind of act as a reserve of grease. As the brakes operate over time, it'll keep the slider pin nice and free. At this point, I'm going to go clean this up, and then we'll re-lubricate it and put it back in. I got this all cleaned up. As you can see, it is not even pitted, so that's great. I'm going to cover this with a thin layer of silicone paste. You can't really put too much on it, because if you do, it'll just get wiped off as you try to put it into the boot. And I definitely want to coat it at the top here where the boot seals up. That's going to make it nice and sealed up. It'll allow it to basically slip over where it needs to go. And now we can put it right into the caliper, just like so, and make sure that that boot goes over, just like that. If there's air trapped in it, what you can do is squeeze the pin, squeeze the boot. That's going to get all the air out. Give it a couple twists, work it back and forth, make sure that everything slides freely, and then you would do the same exact thing to the other pin. Once you've done that, let's clean up the old anti-rattle clips, or I should say underneath them, because we'll have to remove them. Just pry up on them. Sometimes you might need a little screwdriver to pry with if they get too stuck. Okay, sometimes these get quite stuck on here. I don't have an excessive amount of corrosion here, which is great. So I'm just going to take a wire brush, scrub these areas down. But if you had a lot of rust buildup, you want to clean this off even with a sanding disc if that's what you have, or a file sometimes works great. You want it nice and flat. Don't remove too much material, but if it's swollen and raised up, it's actually going to push up on the pad and it'll make it be stuck in place. And then your pads are going to basically drag along the rotor. So you want this nice and cleaned up. Once again, use a wire brush or a sanding disc, whatever works for you. Looks Looks like there's some paint underneath here. If it's chipping off, I definitely want to make sure that I remove that. This definitely helped slow down the corrosion process. Now what I will do to do that exact same thing is put some silicone paste. You can use brake grease if that's what you have, but the grease will prevent corrosion from building up. And you don't want too much. If you actually put too much, it'll squeeze out when you put the anti-rattle clip on. And right here is where the rotor rides in the center, and it'll squeeze out onto the rotor. You want to avoid that. You want the rotor to stay dry and clean. So just a thin layer will do the trick. Now you can take your new anti-rattle clips, should be provided with your brake pads, and snap them on. And you want to make sure that these springs rest on the back side of the caliper, not where the slider pin is. Match them up. There we go. Make sure that's nicely seated, and this hook on the outside needs to kind of go over, and that's what locks it in. Make sure they're both pressed down all the way, and then we'll do the same to the other side. Let's get the caliper bracket reinstalled. We're gonna line it up, put the 2 bolts in. Let's snug them up. The torque for these two is a range between 141 foot-pounds and 191. I'm just gonna go for 190, that's on the higher end, so let's torque these down. All right. Let's get the pads in. Neither of the pads on the front of this vehicle will have wear indicators, so it doesn't matter which one you use. I recommend sliding them in at an angle and then twist them. They should snap in like this and move somewhat freely. You don't want them to be bound up. This is actually what's happening if, as I mentioned previously, there's too much rust at the top, it'll squish the pads in. You want them to be able to slide. Do the same on the outer one, just like that. Sometimes the kit with the pads will come with these little springs. All they do is they keep the pads apart and prevent them from rubbing up against the rotor when you're not applying the brakes. They go into the little cutouts at the top and the bottom of the brake pads and make sure they're facing towards the center. Slide these in. At this point, I'm going to hold the pads so they don't fall off. Bring the caliper in. Bring the caliper in, slide it over, let go of the pads and press this on over the slider pins. Have your bolts ready to start this on. Thread them in. Bottom these out. The torque on these is going to be another range that's between 16 and 30 foot-pounds. I'm going to go for 30 on the higher end once again, but 16 to 30. And there we go. Now do the same on the other side. If you open up the bleeder screws to compress the pistons, top off the master cylinder, pump up the brake pedal, and let's put the wheel on. Let's get the wheel back on. Put on all 8 lug nuts. We'll bottom them out in a cross pattern to seat the wheel evenly. And then also in a cross pattern, we're going to torque them to 148 foot-pounds. One 148 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Here we go. Double check them if you'd like. Take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.